So in this last part of this lecture, we'll talk about some of the ways that we do science in the modern world. So in biology, we often break up the science that we use to improve medicine into three separate stages of the research process. We'll talk about basic science, and basic science is science that is done to better understand things like diseases, the biology of pathogens, and human physiology, like the parts of the immune system. Right? So in basic science, medical treatment is not the immediate goal. We're asking questions and doing experiments to inform our understanding of these basic biological processes. These results can inform the work that's done in the next two stages. Translational science is science that takes those basic science findings and tries to use them to develop things that can be used in the medicine. So it's translating the basic science into clinical science. So this is, for example, doing experiments to find drugs that treat particular diseases, working on diagnostics, or other types of treatments for patients. We then have clinical science. And clinical science is often carried out by clinicians like doctors, nurses, and also many clinical scientists, statisticians, and other support staff that determine whether or not medical interventions actually improve patient health. Also apply science to diagnose disease and analyze the effectiveness of a number of different medical interventions. How is all this science funded? So most of the funding, especially for the basic science step, comes from government agencies. In the United States, the National Institutes of Health, with a budget of $42 billion, and the National Science Foundation, with a budget of $8 billion, fund most of the biological science research in the country. We also have research for science provided by, or money from science research provided by NASA, the Department of Defense, the Forest Service, and other agencies. Right? Government grants are highly competitive, so the NIH structures its grant system in a rather small grant amount per individual scientists and their small labs around the country. So these labs are usually located at academic, medical, and research centers, like those that we'll find at Jefferson and Temple and the University of Pennsylvania. So these grants are applied by individual scientists and faculty members around the country, so they're super competitive. And NIH R01 is about $250,000 a year for 4 to 5 years. And so that's a little more than $1 million, which is a lot of money, but that money funds the research salaries of a number of scientists, right? So they'll probably be the faculty member themselves, a number of research staff such as postdocs and research scientists who work in their lab that are carrying out the actual experiments. And that money also goes to paying for equipment and a number of other expenses that are encountered in the research process. Some money in this country does come from private foundations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates, but that money accounts for about 2 to 3 billion annually compared to the 50 billion that's funded by the NIH and the NSF. We also have funding that comes from for-profit companies like the drug companies. Right? That amount of money in total is approximately equal to the amount of money provided by the U.S. government in the United States. Right? But that money is focused on the last steps, the commercialization of discoveries that were made in the laboratory. That money goes to funding experiments like clinical studies and also improving the manufacturing and efficacy of drugs and medicines. How is science communicated? Right, so there's a number of different routes that we have to talk about science. We have scientific communications, which are communications between scientists. We'll often talk about scientific meetings, and particularly about peer-reviewed journals that we'll talk about extensively here. We also have communication to the public. So we often get a lot of our science news from the media. through press releases, science journalism. You also get some of that communication to the public through your textbooks and Wikipedia, right? And the communication that we teach you in the classroom. We also are communicated science through public policy. Right? So we have lawmakers who are using, hopefully, science to help inform the decisions, the laws and regulations that they make in the legislature. We also have a number of public agencies like advisory committees and the CDC who provide public health guidance based on scientific discoveries in the lab. So scientific papers are something that we're going to focus on a lot in this class. Scientific papers are the primary way that scientific results are communicated to other scientists and to then be critically analyzed and disseminated throughout the field. So the NIH keeps a database of most of the peer-reviewed journal articles that you can find on a website called pubmed.gov. And we'll use this website in class. So scientific papers generally have a pretty common structure. It helps us organize and recognize different parts of the scientific communication. In a scientific paper, you will see an abstract, and an abstract is a brief synopsis of the paper. Right? It helps understand the point of the paper, but it does not give the full results. Within the paper itself, we'll see the introduction, which is the part that gives the background for why the scientists undertook the particular study, right? And other important information. We'll often then have the methods section, which is where the details of how the experiments and the particular steps in the study were done. Then we will see the results section, and the results section is really the most important part of the paper. The results describes the actual observations, the data from the experiments done in the study. In a single scientific paper, the experiments done are generally a set of experiments to study one specific phenomenon, one observation that fits within the broader scope of a research project. So there's a number of experiments, but they're narrowly focused on answering one or a couple questions about a specific area of science. So the results of the experiment are explained in detail in the results section, and then in the conclusion and discussion section of the paper, those results are interpreted. And so the scientists will give, based on their results and based on other information, other results that they are aware of other scientists coming to, what those results mean. In a scientific paper, those conclusions and discussions should be logical and fit in line with the results. But they also often include speculation. And so the results, the data are what they are, and hopefully clearly presented. Right? And the conclusions sometimes are our interpretations of what the results mean. So peer-reviewed studies mean that those papers go through a process called peer review. So peer review means the paper has been critically analyzed by other experts. And this is how the peer review process works for a peer-reviewed paper. First, scientists study something. So they do a number of experiments, make observations, do a lot of important stuff. And when they decide they have some reportable results on a particular phenomenon, they carefully write up the results in the format that we just talked about. They'll then send that manuscript to a scientific journal, where a journal editor who is an expert in a number of scientific fields will read the paper, decide if it is acceptable for publication. Sometimes they will directly suggest to the scientists themselves to make some changes or edits to the paper. But if they think the paper is interesting and worthy of review, they will carefully select a number, typically 3, experts in the field who they know that have a great deal of knowledge on the specific aspect of science that these scientists were researching. Right, so all of these scientists here are all other scientists in the field. They know all of the other research. They're able to critically think about the experiments and really dig into the detail, and so they do that. Typically, this process takes several weeks, where those scientists will spend some time reading and rereading the paper, thinking carefully about what the results mean, and then they will take that and offer constructive critical feedback that they'll send to the journal editor and then will be passed on to the scientist. Those peer reviewers will often suggest changes in interpretations of results. They will often suggest new experiments that need to be done, controls that need to be included in the experiments that were done previously, or they might even suggest that the scientists go back to the drawing board and reevaluate their entire research study. However, once those peer reviewers are satisfied with the research, they will accept it for publication in the journal. So that final result, the peer-reviewed research, has been the result of a carefully planned and written up experiment. Right? It will then have gone through this editing process where the editor carefully looks over the paper, and then it will be independently reviewed by 3 experts who will really tear the paper apart, make sure that all the research was done as carefully as possible, and have those scientists revise and redo a number of things before it can actually be published. So the peer review process takes a long time. It can often takes months to even years for some really big studies. And so today we have a number of important publications called preprint publications. So it used to be that you would send a paper straight to peer review, and it would take months before the data actually saw the light of day. Before it was published, only the journal editor and that handful of peer reviewers actually knew anything about the results. But in today's science, we think it's a benefit to have some of the data out in public beforehand. So we have what we call preprint servers, where scientists can upload their preprints before the peer review process is over, and they can be read and reviewed. Those manuscripts can be read and reviewed by people all over the world. Some of these preprint servers that you'll see are bioRxiv and medRxiv, which respectively host preprints for biology and health sciences. Right? It's important to recognize these preprint servers, they are not subject to peer review. Right? It can be that people can just upload whatever to these servers, although they will get removed quickly if they are just junk. Typically, if you see some preprints from some reputable scientists at big research institutions, they'll probably be good and carefully done science, but they haven't gone yet through the process of peer review where they've been scrutinized by independent experts. So often these papers are really interesting, but they shouldn't be taken as the final word in any sense. If a particular study is of interest to the public, it's also often picked up by a number of media corporations, right? Where they will communicate those interesting findings to the public. So certain media organizations are better at this than others. Right? A good science journalist is going to be well aware of how the process of science works. They're going to be appropriately skeptical of the data. They're going to ask other experts for their interpretation and how seriously they should take the particular study, incorporate that into their reporting. Some institutions that I think do a good job of this are the New York Times and National Public Radio, as well as Science Magazine, which is a publication of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, or AAAS, and they have a news website that I read on a regular basis. Wikipedia is also a really good source for public communication. So Wikipedia, as many of you are aware, is written by community volunteers that edit those articles on Wikipedia. So you should be aware, as I think many of your high school teachers have told you, that Wikipedia is open for editing by anyone, and so you could have a troll hijack the page and write some nonsense on there. But in general, I find that the science pages, especially for biology, are really quite accurate. I think the volunteers that do those editing are very good. I use Wikipedia all the time, and I will certainly accept it as a source for many of the research projects I ask you to do. So another important area of communication is public policy, right? So we have findings that are communicated through government organizations to make regulations and often and also to maintain public health standards. And some of those include the World Health Organization, the FDA, and the CDC. Right? We also have public organizations that make recommendations based on the science. Right? And there are a number of well-reputed public advocacy organizations that I would recommend that you take seriously, such as the American Heart Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Society for Microbiology. So each of these different areas of science communication have some pros and cons. For example, peer-reviewed journals, they are the gold standard for accurate information. It is important to remember that peer-reviewed journal articles only cover a small subset, a number of experiments done, one study in a broad field. And so generally we say that one study or one paper is not sufficient for to be the be-all and end-all. Remember, we're always reevaluating and reinterpreting results. But especially really well-done studies are much more, are really important. And those are the most important way that we communicate science between scientists. Of course, because they're written for scientists, they include a lot of jargon, which you will see as you get experience reading those papers. Oftentimes, those peer-reviewed journals are behind a paywall, and they can be pretty expensive to read those journal articles, although more of them are being freely provided to the public. Also, those studies focus on really incremental questions, and so you're not going to see the end of a debate in a single paper. We also have public communication where we have those are written for a general audience and can help put the science in a broader context and also consider the work of several different studies at once. Right? Some cons, though, is that you really need to have a good science journalist to give an accurate interpretation of a particular study, as the accuracy of those papers can get lost if people are trying to dumb it down or try to make analogies based on those results that really don't hold up. We also have a number of instances where the media sensationalizes a result and maybe thinks that a particular study is going to be more important than it actually should be. Public policy is a really important aspect of science communication, right? So it's written by experts for public use. It often considers multiple peer-reviewed studies in the recommendations, so it really has a broad range of evidence behind it. However, as you'll find, it's really difficult to use science to give clear advice. And also, sometimes public policy can be influenced by political considerations. So, how should you read science now that you all are scientists? So first, you should develop a good sense of to know who to trust. Right? You should be able, especially by the end of your biology degree, to go to the source and critically read peer-reviewed studies. Hopefully, you're going to learn to be appropriately skeptical. Generally, in science, people are honest, right? But you need to be aware that even honest people have individual biases. Right? They may not have carefully considered all the alternative explanations for a particular result. So you should learn to look at the data and make up your mind on your own. In order to do that, you need to learn how the experiments were done. And we're going to talk carefully throughout the semester about how experiments were done and how we should think critically about them. You should consider the limitations of the methods that were used. And you should always understand that new data can change theories, and you should be open to reevaluating your understanding of how the world works as you go.